Okay, today I just wanted to do a quick video about explaining log and S-log and C-log and D-log and V-log and hopefully clarify something that helped me to understand the whole log gamma curve thing because it does get very confusing after a while. So I want to start first with this analogy, and the analogy is this. Imagine that you've got a bowl of plain oatmeal. There's no flavor in it. It's just regular oatmeal. Now, this is roughly corresponding to a Rec 709 monitor with a limited dynamic range. Now, you can't add any more to the bowl. So in order to add more to the bowl, you need to convert it to something else to make room. So in this case, the input data coming into the camera sensor is converted into a gamma curve. And so by way of analogy, you could think that we're going to take that oatmeal and we're going to dehydrate it. And we're going to factor out the water. It's still oatmeal, but we're going to take all the water out and make room. So now that we've kind of remapped wet oatmeal into dry oatmeal, now we can add more to the bowl. However, even if we add more like sugar and spice and fruit, it's still not fit for consumption as it is. And it needs to be converted back to an acceptable format. So when you take the input data that's coming from the sensor and remap it into a gamma curve, that's why it looks terrible on your monitor. It's kind of like dehydrated oatmeal. It's been converted into something else, and it can't be properly displayed for your eyes unless you convert it back through a LUT. So anyway, the next step then is to rehydrate or apply a LUT or reconvert the dehydrated oatmeal back into regular oatmeal and factor back in the water. Now, when we do that, we now have more flavor data than we had before. Now we can enjoy more in the space that we had. And so this is a very crude analogy, very primitive, but it's how I kind of get my mind around what's happening with converting the input data into output data and then converting it back. But this is part of the reason why it's very easy to get confused with what's actually happening. And I know I've been more than confused myself on several occasions. The main point of this video is really to say that the fundamentals of exposure do not change with digital cameras. You still need three things, and these are your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. That forms a triangle, and there's plenty on the internet about what a proper exposure is. With a digital camera, no matter whether, I'm not talking about RAW, I'm just talking about gamma, curves, and logs, the fundamentals of exposure do not change. So if you have a proper aperture, shutter, and ISO, and let's say you're using a light meter, then you will have a proper exposure whether you are shooting in log mode or not. It really doesn't matter. If you meet those requirements of having the right aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, you are going to have a properly exposed image. What the log mode is doing only affects the output, not the input. So I found this graph pretty helpful. The blue bars actually represent S-log2. So as you can see, there's S-log2 is putting more data into the highs in the highlights. And as you can see, S-log3, which is in red, is actually putting more data into the shadows. So you could say the only difference really between S-log2 and S-log3 is that S-log2 has more data in the highlights and S-log3 has more data in the shadows. So which S-log would you choose? If you're wanting shadows, you want to emphasize shadows, then you'd want to get S-log3. But mind you, that's a conversion that's happening on the output level, not at the input level. The confusion arises because log mode affects the output from the camera, not the input. And so people get away from start forgetting about the fundamentals of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. If a log curve places middle gray at 33 IRE, it is remapping the input middle gray value. It's not resetting it. Middle gray for a proper exposure stays where it is. Let's say it's supposed to be at 41.7 for Rec 709. The gamma curve, log curve can come in and put that somewhere else, but that doesn't mean that the input value has changed. Middle gray is still middle gray. The log mode simply remaps it on the output side. But on the input side, middle gray stays where it is. This is from Art Adams, who's written a lot of really great articles about all this. So if you're specifically looking at the S-log curves, the G40 means 18% gray is plotted where it should be at 40 IRE. G36 means that instead of plotting 18% gray at 40 IRE, as in whatever he's talking about there, Sony has pulled it down maybe a half a stop to 36 IRE. Now, this is the most important sentence if you only remember one thing about this whole video. This does not mean that you should expose middle gray any differently. All it is saying is that Sony has shifted it on the output side. So middle gray is still at 40, where it's supposed to be for a properly exposed image. It's just that the gamma curve has remapped it to a different value. This doesn't mean that you should expose middle gray any differently, meaning that you still have the fundamentals of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to rely on to get a proper exposure. Since gamma curves or logs remap the input values, that is where the properly exposed middle gray point is, to the output, that is to the viewfinder or waveform monitor, it can be confusing because it looks like something is wrong with the exposure, when in fact nothing is wrong. This is why you need LUTs on your monitor, so it can convert it back into what it should look like or what it's going to look like, so you can see what's really going on. And what happens, at least what happens to me, is that you start thinking that the output is the input and forget that a proper exposure still requires the fundamentals of a proper aperture, ISO, and shutter speeds. Or as I like to say, a light meter is still a useful tool, even in the digital age. What adds to the confusion, and this has really been a sore spot for me, is that you can use the remapped output to gauge if you have a proper exposure, even though you should be making sure the input is correct on the front end. So the only example I could think of this was if someone's walking a dog on a 6-foot leash, if we know the dog's location, then we know that the owner is within at least 6 feet. However, that does not mean the dog's location, the remapped middle gray value, is the same as the owner's location, which is the input or the actual middle gray value for a properly exposed image. So nevertheless, we can use the dog to find the owner. So when you're looking at your waveform monitor and the gamma curve has reset middle gray to 33, you can map it back and know that 33 on the waveform monitor is actually where middle gray is supposed to be. And you're going to end up with, once you convert it back, once you convert the dehydrated oatmeal back into regular oatmeal, you can know that that image is going to be properly exposed, even though on the waveform monitor it looks like middle gray is at 33. That's just the output, not the input. So middle gray is still at 40, but the gamma curve has remapped it to 33. So you're basically using the dog to make sure where the owner is. So there's a relationship between the output and the input, but they are not the same. And I mentioned this, I don't know, the problem is also complicated, again, by Sony's S-Logs 2 and 3, which actually require you to overexpose your image by 1.5 stops. When you do this, you are actually putting the input middle gray somewhere it normally isn't, which is a stop and a half above. So let's say middle gray is normally at 40 IRE. Now you've got middle gray sitting at 60. I don't think those are the exact numbers, but it's up by a stop and a half. So the bottom line is this, and I hope this is helpful to you. The fundamentals of a proper exposure have not changed with gamma curves and logs. A proper exposure still requires a proper aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And just like all the things that a light meter has, gamma curves only affect the output values and do not affect the input. So you can still use your light meter to get a proper exposure. And what the gamma curve is doing to it, you really don't even need to worry about it, except for maybe making sure that you're not clipping your highlights. However, on some cameras like the Sony FS7, you only have zebras and a waveform monitor to gauge proper exposure. This means you have to be vigilant that what you are monitoring is the remapped output values and not the original input data coming off the sensor. Or I could say, by way of analogy, the dog is not the owner. So remember that the fundamentals of a proper exposure do not change with digital technology. These curves just allow us to take our oatmeal, dehydrate it, add more data to it, and then rehydrate it back and with more data than it had originally. But the original oatmeal is still the thing. You still have to apply the fundamentals of cooking and make sure you put in the right amount of water and that you heat it right and you cook it long enough to get it cooked properly in the first place. Then once it's cooked properly, then you can change it into something else, add more data to it, and then put it back into a form that is acceptable for viewing, or in the case of the analogy, eating. So anyway, this is just a quick video I put together. I hope you found it helpful. I know I've been getting confused at it, and once you get past this initial confusion, things start becoming clearer. But the bottom line is the fundamentals don't change. Take care and have a great day.